The Battle of Midway is one of the most decisive and important battles in naval history, completely changing the course of the Pacific War. With Japan seeing victory after victory, it represented America's last chance to take back control of the Pacific and get revenge for Pearl Harbour. If America had been defeated, it would have left Japan with complete supremacy over East Asia and the Pacific, changing the course of history, and leaving Korea, China, Australia and New Zealand under the brutal control of the Japanese Empire. If you want to forge your own version of history and recreate the most iconic moments of World War II, then check out today's sponsor, Call of War. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game set during the Second World War, where you can select your favourite country and fight for world domination against up to 100 other players in real time. Forge alliances, invade your neighbours and unlock history's most iconic secret weapons in massive matches that can take weeks to complete. And with cross-platform options to play on both PC and mobile, you'll never be far from the action. One of the game's most exciting features is its huge tech tree, featuring over 120 historically accurate units, allowing you to bombard coastal cities with mighty naval fleets, command battalions of infantry, or dominate the battlefield with secret weapons such as the V2 rocket. If you want to support our channel and get access to exclusive in-game rewards, then click on the link in the description to receive 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so click the link now to make sure you don't miss out. In the wake of victory at Pearl Harbour, and thinking that the American fleet had been neutralised, Japan embarked on a devastating path of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within a month, Japan had attacked Thailand, British Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma and Borneo, as well as the American Philippines, Guam and Wake Island. A month later, Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and a month after that, they invaded Singapore, the crown jewel of British imperial rule in the East. By 1942, Japan had established its dominance over the Pacific. In a mere 6 months, Japan had wiped out most of the Allied presence in the Far East, with their conquest of the Pacific almost complete. But as Japan had attacked the US territories of Pearl Harbour, the Philippines, as well as Guam and Wake Island, the United States were looking for revenge. American President Franklin Roosevelt was looking for a way to strike back against the Japanese in an attempt to boost morale and to give the public something to celebrate. And so he would launch the Doolittle Raid in April 1942, sending a squadron of 16 land-based army bombers from aircraft carriers in the Pacific to attack Japan's 4 major cities including Tokyo. Although the attack was militarily insignificant, only killing around 50 people, it came as a deep psychological shock to the Japanese people. Up to this point, they had only seen success after success, with it being almost unthinkable that Japan itself might be attacked. As the attack had been launched from American aircraft carriers, the destruction of these carriers would become the highest priority. They would have to be eliminated if Japan was to remain safe. But in order to do this, Japan would look to solidify their position in East Asia and the Pacific, with New Guinea becoming their new point of focus. With New Guinea under Japanese control, it would allow them to establish a vertical defensive line along the Pacific, behind which Japan could establish their maritime empire, a region they referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. From New Guinea, Japan could launch attacks and drive the US out of Midway and Hawaii, giving them complete supremacy over the region, but it would also allow Japan to isolate Australia, as well as further expand into New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa. For the Japanese, New Guinea was a strategic necessity. But in order to capture the rest of New Guinea, Japan would have to take over the southern half of the island, in particular the harbour at Port Moresby. The campaign to take Port Moresby would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first all-aircraft naval battle in history. After 2 days of heavy fighting, it would appear to be a draw, with each side having lost an aircraft carrier. The American carrier Yorktown had also been severely damaged, with the Japanese thinking it had been taken out of action. But strategically, it was a tactical victory for the United States, as they had successfully stopped the invasion of Port Moresby. Crucially, it was the first time in the Pacific War that Japan had failed to take over a region they had targeted. With the Japanese unable to take over Port Moresby and them fearing another attack on their homeland, all attention would now go to destroying America's Pacific Fleet. The only way they saw to do this was to take out the last remaining major American base in the Pacific, an island that went by the name of Midway. Six months after Pearl Harbour, and 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japan were ready to strike again. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, believed it was crucial for the American aircraft carriers to be destroyed, as they posed an enormous risk to mainland Japan, as shown with the Doolittle raids. But in order for them to be destroyed, they would have to be brought out into the open. And so Yamamoto set up an elaborate plan. Japan would invade the US island of Midway, which served as an airbase and refueling station for US aircraft. The small island of Midway was not of any particular strategic importance for Japan, but the Japanese knew the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost that provided them a defensive line for Pearl Harbour, and therefore they would have no choice but to defend the island. With the American fleet being sent in defence, its aircraft carriers would be open to attack, where Japanese submarines, battleships, and a fleet of aircraft carriers known as the Kido Butai would be waiting to ambush them. The Kido Butai was the hallmark of the Japanese Navy. Responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbour, it was the single most powerful naval fleet in the world, and if America were to be defeated, this would be the fleet to do it. But unknown to the Japanese, there were two major flaws with their plan. First, the Japanese thought the Americans only had 2 aircraft carriers, believing they had already sunk both the Lexington and Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but the Yorktown still survived. And second, the Americans knew the entire plan. With Japan on the offensive, the fate of the American fleet lay with Station Hypo, the American intelligence base in Pearl Harbour. On May 7, 1942, codebreakers at Station Hypo would intercept and decipher several messages that the Japanese were planning a major attack on a target codenamed AF. Joseph Rochefort, head of the code-breaking operation at Station Hypo, believed that AF was the Japanese code for Midway, but in order to make sure and provide proof to his superiors, he devised a cunning plan. The base at Midway would send out an uncoded radio message to Hawaii, falsely stating that their water purification system had broken down. Sure enough, within 24 hours, American codebreakers picked up a Japanese message that stated AF was short on water. Rochefort's suspicions had been confirmed. They were able to further determine the date of the attack as either the 4th or 5th of June, as well as the Japanese strategy. All this information was then sent to the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Chester Nimitz, who decided to set a trap of his own. Nimitz's plan would utilise the element of surprise. He would send all 3 of his aircraft carriers several hundred miles north of Midway, to a position named Point Luck, correctly calculating that the Japanese would never look there. From this position, once the Japanese had launched an attack on Midway, their carriers would be exposed, making them easy targets for American pilots. Nimitz's plan was in place. He would then refuel the aircraft carriers Hornet and Enterprise and repair the damaged Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance would command the Hornet and Enterprise, while Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would command the Yorktown. Spruance would head out first, and 2 days later, on the 30th of May, the Yorktown would set sail, with workmen remaining on board making last-minute repairs. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would launch a total of 108 aircraft, all sent to attack the island of Midway. A wave of Japanese bombers appeared over the island, striking at the airfields below. But unexpectedly, the US bombers, one of their main targets, were nowhere to be seen, and the airfields lay practically empty. Instead, the Japanese would face a squadron of outdated American Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcat fighters. While most were shot down by the far superior Japanese Zeros, they had managed to slightly blunt the Japanese attack. The initial attack had not succeeded, and American bombers could still use the airbase to refuel and attack the Japanese invasion force. The commander of the strike force, Lieutenant Joichi Tomanaga, radioed back that a second strike was needed in order to fully destroy the American base, but as the Japanese prepared for a second strike, the bombers from Midway appeared overhead. The American force consisted of an assortment of Army, Marine and Navy planes, but they were all outdated and the Japanese Zeros quickly shot them down. Admiral Nagumo was then told one of his search planes had sighted what appeared to be a carrier. As American carriers were the actual target of the whole operation, Nagumo decided not to attack Midway again, and instead head north in pursuit. 2 more waves of American aircraft would attack the Japanese fleet, but the planes were uncoordinated and shot down. Of the 41 torpedo bombers the Americans sent to attack the Japanese fleet that morning, only 4 of them safely returned, with none able to place a single torpedo on target. The Americans, even with the element of surprise, appeared to have failed. The Japanese were winning the Battle of Midway. It was an almost unprecedented disaster for America. It would be the next 10 minutes that changed the course of the battle, and subsequently, the entire Pacific War. A squadron from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky, then arrived at the Japanese fleet's original coordinates, not knowing they had moved north. McClusky and his men had a difficult decision to make: head back to the Enterprise or go searching for the Japanese fleet and possibly run out of fuel. Luckily, McClusky then spotted a single Japanese destroyer named the Arashi moving northward, as it had been left behind to fight off the American submarine Nautilus. McClusky assumed that the destroyer was heading north to rejoin its fleet, and he was right. His air group flew northward, and soon found themselves above the entire Japanese carrier fleet. Although the previous attacks on the Japanese fleet had been unsuccessful, many of the Zero fighter planes were now running low on fuel and ammunition. As McClusky's bombers began to attack, another squadron of dive bombers arrived from the Yorktown. The largest carrier, the Kaga, would be hit first, with a dozen 500 and 1,000 pound bombs setting it ablaze within minutes. The Akagi would be next, with a fatal 1,000 pound bomb penetrating the centre of the flight deck, exploding the 18 fully loaded torpedo bombers on board. Simultaneously, bombers from the Yorktown attacked the Soryu, which was set alight within seconds. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had now been obliterated, with only the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, managing to escape. The Hiryu, in desperation for revenge, then launched an attack against the Yorktown, which would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine. In retaliation, all available aircraft from the Enterprise and Hornet were sent to sink the Hiryu, and they were successful. The Kido Butai was now gone. In just a single day, Japan's naval power had been completely obliterated. Yamamoto's plan had backfired, and the United States were now free to roam the Pacific. but the Battle of Midway redefined the importance of air superiority for the remainder of the war, and with 4 Japanese carriers out of the equation, the Japanese would never again launch a major offensive in the Pacific. Don't forget to check out today's sponsor, Call of War. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so choose your country and fight your way to victory today.